Good evening, everybody. My name is Simon Carey. I'm Chairman for the Planning Board, and welcome to our first of hopefully many now continuing education for requirements. Today we have Bruce and John. They're both they give up their time to help us with this, and we'll let them introduce themselves and take it from there.
Thanks. Good evening, everybody. My name is Bruce Barber. I'm the town's environmental planning consultant, and welcome. Thank you all for attending this evening. Tonight we're going to talk about two topics that come up an awful lot for the planning board, the zoning board, residents in general, and folks that just are sometimes really curious of what goes on in general too. I'm going to talk a bit about wetlands. Mr. Andrews is going to talk about site planning. And so the idea behind this is that we have two different types of presentations. For mine, if you have questions, just raise your hand. We have a microphone. If somebody can take that and ask your questions, please interrupt me, and we'll take questions on the fly, okay? So let's get started. Wetlands seem to me to be one of the most confusing aspects for most people to deal with when you're looking at plans, when you're evaluating projects, because the question comes up oftentimes, what's the big deal with wetlands? Why are we protecting them? Why are they so hard to deal with? Why are they such a difficulty? So we're going to talk a little bit about a couple of different things with wetlands, and these are our topics for tonight. Topic number one is, what is a wetland and why are they important? This is the science part of wetlands. What makes a wetlands and what is not a wetlands? Topic number two is, who regulates the wetlands and why do they regulate the wetlands? So that's the permitting part of tonight's show. And section number three is how wetlands impact the planning process. For all you planning board members who are sitting up here that see this on a very, very regular basis, how does this all fit into the larger picture of what you do on an almost daily basis? So let's get into it. So first of all, the one thing you need to know, as you might be aware, is that not all wetlands are the same. There are all different types of wetlands. Right, so you have the ones that we commonly think of with the cattails and the skunk cabbage and the standing water, kind of maybe towards down where the batting cages used to be, those types of areas. Those are clearly wetlands, but wetlands sometimes are not so apparent. We can have wetlands that have shrubs and what are called shrub-scrub wetlands that oftentimes dry during the summer months. They're not readily apparent as wetlands except during certain times of the year. We have forested wetlands where you're walking through the woods and you wouldn't know that they are wetlands except for the vegetation and certain characteristics. We have wet meadows where there's just all grasses and nothing really much besides that. Bogs, which are not typical around here, but we see them around typically, and something called vernal pools, which are ephemeral wetlands that are here today, kind of in the springtime, and gone tomorrow in the summertime, and have very special characteristics for habitat for amphibians and threatened and endangered species. So the first thing to realize is that it's a little complicated because we have a lot of different kinds of wetlands to contend with. Why are they important? Well, the first thing is that everybody, I believe in this room, gets their water from a well. And so wetlands protect groundwater as it rains and runs off. It seeps down into the ground, and the wetlands act basically as sponges to retain that groundwater and allow it to percolate slowly through the ground. And during that time frame, certain microorganisms will act on some of the pollutants and characteristics of that water, and as it works its way down towards where you're going to be drinking it from in the aquifers, the water is cleansed and becomes potable. So wetlands on a groundwater recharge, replenishing that water supply to your wells is very important. Pollutant treatment I just alluded to. Wetlands oftentimes are designed to treat pollutants, such as stormwater pollutants. So if you look all around Lake Carmel, you'll see, maybe 9 or 10 of these large depressional areas with cattails and vegetation growing out of those. Those are man-made percival wetlands that are treating the stormwater. The vegetation there absorbs the nutrient loads before it gets into the lake and fertilizes the algae and harmful algal blooms in the lake. So a pollutant treatment, flood attenuation. We're getting some horrific rain events these days and a lot of flooding. So wetlands basically, again, act as that sponge, and they absorb that water and attenuate flood flow so that hopefully it won't be as damaging. Habitat, they are unique areas for very strong biodiversity and strong habitat characteristics. All sorts of animals get their starts and have their lifespan, at least part of it, in wetlands. Sediment trapping, where you have water that's coming and running off of streams, where the stream banks have become eroded. That itself is a pollutant load by itself, sediment, and the wetlands will trap that sediment and keep it in place before it gets into the receiving waters. Education, they're really popular for people to come out and learn about. High school AP classes, there's actually now college majors at several universities that are just specific to wetland science. Nutrient sinks, the soils in the wetlands hold all these different nutrients and all these cycles that we kind of maybe in a fuzzy way remember from high school biology or chemistry in terms of carbon cycling and nitrogen cycling and all of these types of cycles that are going on with nutrients being used and replenished, and they act as carbon sinks and nutrient sinks. And most importantly for carbon sinks, carbon is what holds the carbon elements into the soil and reduces the global warming and climate change to the degree it can. So there's a lot of things that wetlands do, and that's kind of why they're protected now. Because not so long ago, they were looked at as worthless land, and they were filled in to make more agriculture, to drain them, to grow crops. And it was only recently, within the last, let's say, 50 to 60 years, that they were recognized for the values that they have. So,
Bruce?
yeah.
Going back to this slide where you said there's lots of different types of wetlands.
Yeah.
In Kent, which would you say of those wetlands are the most dominant of those types?
Jackie, we have all of them with the exception that we have very few bogs here. Bogs are very specialized. You need an alkaline type of geology and soils to have bogs work. Generally, we don't see that many bogs. Those are where you typically see like the plants that are carnivorous plants, like Venus flytraps, things like that. We don't see that commonly. We have an awful lot of vernal pools. We have an awful lot of swamps and marshes. We have virtually all of these, with the possible exception we don't have a lot of bogs. Okay, so we see pretty much all of them all the time. Forested ones we see a real lot of. You know, on sloped areas where you wouldn't think that they're wetlands, but they are. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I used to think that pretty much just when you saw the cattails and you saw that was where the sign of wetlands, so that's helpful.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of different types, as you can see. Okay, so what are wetlands from a regulatory perspective? Well, that depends upon who you guys talk to. You have the Army Corps of Engineers. Why are they interested in wetlands? We have the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, fondly called DEC in our world. We have the City of New York, of which the watershed is almost the entire town of Kent, with very small exceptions. That's DEP. We have local municipal, town of Kent has jurisdiction over wetlands. And so what is a wetland, and how do the wetland regulations kind of vary as time goes on? Well, the first thing that you have to do is figure out where the wetland is or isn't. And there's 3 different parameters that are used to figure out if there's a wetland or if it's not. So if you're walking along and you see a puddle, well, you might say, well, that looks like a wetland to me, but it has to meet these 3 criteria in order to be classified as a wetland. And you see, in common with all these things is the word hydric or hydro, which means water. Hydric soils, hydrology, and hydrophytic vegetation, which simply means vegetation that thrives in wet soil conditions, okay? So all of the methodology that we use, no matter where we go, to delineate wetlands is found in this manual here. This is the 1987 Army Corps of Engineers Wetland Delineation Manual. This is the cookbook of what we use to determine how a wetland is or is not present on a property. But because all wetlands throughout the country are not the same, there's also something called a regional supplement. In different areas of the country, there are different characteristics that constitute a wetland. So this is the supplement along with this manual that we use to ascertain where a wetland boundary is, following the cookbook that is that particular manual. So when you hear me talk about it's in the manual, or it's in the Army Corps manual, or something like that, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, Tom?
Of the three types, does it have to meet all three or just one of the three?
We're going to get to that. Different regulatory agencies have a different approach to it. And even different states, Tom, have different approaches to it. Let's talk about soils first. Okay, the rule of thumb is that if you see a soil with a darker color, and this is not always the case, that has a tendency to be a hydric or wetland soil. Think of your experience walking around someplace. This is the kind of soil where your shoe gets stuck and you're trying to get your foot out and your shoe gets stuck in the mud and it's really hard to do that. That kind of soil, that dark soil. Does anybody want to take a shot as to why the soil is very dark in color? Minerals. Yeah. So what happens is that when you have water in the soil for a long period of time, there's no air in the soil. Because remember, soil is composed of minerals, but also has voids, spaces in between the minerals. And those spaces, if they're filled with water, there's not a lot of what's called aerobic activity going on in the soil. And the aerobic activity is what breaks down the leaf litter and the things that are falling on the ground every year and creating more and more soil. But if there's not aerobic conditions, meaning the soil is filled with water, then that process is very, very slow under anaerobic conditions of breaking down of that organic material, and so you get that darker color material in the top or areas of the soils. Now that, again, is a general idea. There's also soils that are almost like white or light blue in colored, which are called glade soils, where the water and the nutrients have literally been leached out of the soil down into the bottom of the lower horizons of the soil, and that at times is wetland soils as well. You also have things called redoxymorphic features, which is used to be called soil modeling, where you see almost like an orange color, which is the iron in the soil that's oxidizing when you have anaerobic and aerobic conditions. So all of these things are symptoms, if you will, of soils. And what we do as part of the Army Corps of Engineers manual, this is called the Munsell Soil Book. And in here, there are these charts. Let's see if I can pull it out here. Can you guys see this? Mm-hmm. These different colors? Okay, so there's three components. There's hue, color, and value of these colors. And based upon that, can you see these darker colors down in the bottom over here? Can everybody see that? You're starting to take your soil sample that you've dug under the basic province of the manual, and you're putting it behind here, trying to match up how close that is to that color. And if it's within a certain color range and characteristic, that's considered a hydric soil. So that's one of the ways that you determine if there's a wetland there. And remember, there's three ways. So that's soils. So basically what we do is we look at existing soils maps. So if you hear me say, we're looking at the NRCS soil maps, which are the National Resource Conservation Service maps. They have soil maps throughout the entire country and certainly throughout the town of Kent. And in there you have certain soil types are going to be identified. And some of those soils are identified as wetland soils in our town code. So one of the screening elements that John and I both do is we look at soil maps as part of our planning process to see what might be out there. But the soils are not site-specific. They have to be proven out into the field. And this basic soil katina means that as you go down a slope and you start to intercept the groundwater more and more at the bottom of the slope, generally that's where you're finding your wetland soil. So it's not untrue that in a lot of circumstances, you'll see wetlands in these depressional areas, right? And that's very common, but not always. Sometimes you'll see wetlands that are because you have seeps that are coming out the side of the hill because the groundwater has been intercepted by the slope of the land. So soils are one thing. So these are pictures of two different types of soils. The one on the left is pretty much farmland soil that is an aerobic soil. I think I got that from a construction site someplace. And you can see that's a pretty typical color soil. And then the one on the right, that's a wetland soil, okay? So you can see the contrast between the two colors of the soil. So that's number one, that's what we look at. Number two is hydrology. Now, this is something y'all can do when you're walking around and you see these depressional areas and the leaves are kind of flattened and they're stained and they're maybe a little bit discolored, where you can see there must have been standing water there at one point in time. That is sediment or stained leaves. That's a hydrological indicator. If you ever walk through the woods and see these trees, and you know, they got pretty narrow kind of trunks, but then there's some that are really fluted. You know, they're branched out at the bottom like this. That's called buttressing. The tree is actually starting or trying to get up out of the water and into oxygen, and it's buttressing itself out to try to do that. That's a sign that you have water there and possible wetlands. And so these different types of hydrological indicators. Number three is hydrophytic vegetation. So these are plants. And you have different strata. You have trees, shrubs, grasses, herbaceous elements that are all these different stratas. And it's not when you're walking through a wetland where you see a site, where you see a skunk cabbage and you go, aha, that's a wetland. Because it might be, but that's not definitive enough. You have to have other supporting vegetation that is what's called dominant species that likes to grow in the wetlands. There's species that you can think of that really like the wetlands, and there's species that we'll never see in the wetlands. And so as you're walking through the woods and you're seeing species of plants that are typically found in wetlands, that's what you're starting to do. And there's an actual methodology in terms of using transects to determine vegetation sampling and making sure you have adequate amount of dominance in each strata to determine if you have hydrophytic dominance. So these are kinds of things that we see. So garlic mustard is an invasive species, kind of ubiquitous to the area. When you're walking through the woods and you see something like this, these guys like to be right on the edge of wetlands. They're not really wetland plants, but if you're walking through the woods, this gives me an indication that we're getting maybe close to something that's going to be a wetlands. One on the left is our very famous skunk cabbage. We've all seen that, maybe even had a snack on that at one time or another. The one on the right is called tussock sedge. These are plants that are always found in wetlands, called obligate plant species. Spice bush, this is a shrub that's close to the edge, right on the edge of wetlands. Typically we find them. They like kind of to be on the edge. This is red osier dogwood, winter shot. I'm sure you've seen these around. These like to grow in ditches and stuff, and we see them on the edge of wetlands. Witch hazel as well. Red maple is the most ubiquitous tree that we have in our wetlands in the town of Kent. It's called a facultative tree. It grows best in any soils, but it is a wetland indicator. The American elm is also a tree that we see that's a wetland indicator as well. So this is just a sampling. There are hundreds of plants to know as you walk through a wetland to determine if they're wetlands or not and if they're dominant in that particular area. Shagbark hickory, also something that likes to live on the edge of wetlands. And then tulip trees too. Okay, and these musclewood trees, again, these are all indicators as you're walking through the woods that I might be getting close to wetlands. I might be right on the edge. Okay, does anybody have any questions of how we figure out where a wetland is? 3 parameters: soils, hydrology, and hydrophytic vegetation. All good?
One last thing. The town of Kent, wetlands in the town of Kent have a little different hook to them. And
We'll
we
get there.
experienced on a quick, and I don't know whether it's now or later.
We'll get there.
All right.
We'll get there. There's always a little hook here. All right, so let's go next to the regulatory part. This is all right, so now we have the science done. This is where wetlands are, but this is the who cares part. All right, because if it's not regulated, is it really a wetlands? Well, yeah, it is, but we're not going to be dealing with it on our level at the planning process. The scientists might, the conservationists might, but we're not going to. So there's several agencies involved, and this is where it gets really confusing, right? You got the Army Corps of Engineers on the federal level, you got the DEC on the state level, you got the DEP on the city level, and you got our beautiful town of Kent here, Chapter 39A of the Town Code, which is freshwater wetlands. 4 different masters to please, okay?
And we have DEP. We have DEP here because we're part of the reservoir system. Not all towns in New York, for example, would have DEP.
There are some lucky towns that don't have the DEP. You're right. We are not so lucky. So anyway, Let's start with the Army Corps of Engineers. So Army Corps of Engineers is authorized by the Secretary of the Army and through the chief engineers to regulate and issue wetland permits. Why would they care about wetlands? What does that have to do with our federal government? Flooding. Even something that's been since almost the beginning of our country started, with wetlands and what have you. They need to keep the waterways, the waters of the United States open for commerce, shipping, and transportation. Wetlands provide an adjunct and an aid to that, so they regulate the dredging and filling of waters of the United States. And that's the Army Corps, and you can see this just gives you an idea of what they look at. They include, but are not limited to, building structures such as bulkheads, piers, catwalks, boathouses, pilings, excavations. You can read all this. There's a lot of stuff that they look at when they are dealing with a water of the United States. Now, not all wetlands are construed and considered waters of the United States. Okay. Also, the Army Corps does not regulate anything but that. We're going to talk about buffers in a minute. Areas outside of the edge of the wetland boundaries called wetland buffers. When you're looking for an Army Corps of Engineering permit, you're looking for what's called a 401 water quality certification, and that's a joint application that you fill out with a DEC wetland application. So DEC wetlands, this is more of what we considered and what we talked about before, these different types of wetlands. They must be 12.4 acres in size presently to be regulated. That's pretty big, right? Smaller wetlands might be protected if they are found to be of special value or if they have threatened and endangered species that have been located in them. They also categorize their wetlands in terms of what they think the value of the wetlands are, classes 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1 being the most important wetlands as far as they're concerned, and 4 being the least important. So they have a classification system of wetlands. When you're applying for a DEC permit, it's called an Article 24 permit. They have major and minor permits. The DEC also regulates 100 feet away from the edge of the wetland boundary, and that's called a wetland buffer. And we talk about wetland buffers all the time. How do they figure out where the wetlands are for DEC? There are DEC wetland maps that they put together several years back and periodically amend. There are field biologists that go out into the location on the site, and it will verify the wetland delineation. And that's why if you ever hear me ask about, is there a wetland validation block? An executed wetland validation block is a little square on a set of plans that's stamped and says the DEC has looked at these wetlands and found them to be accurate. And so that's what DEC is stating in a wetland validation block. Also, there's something that's a search tool online called the NYSDEC Environmental Resource Mapper. You can go into that and find a general idea of where wetlands are, as well as a check zone area. A check zone we talk about sometimes where it's not necessarily in the wetlands itself on the environmental mapper, but it's up 500 feet away potentially. So they shade that area as well, and DEC reserves the right to go down and inspect something in the check zone. So those are DEC wetlands. DEC, to answer your question, Tom, relies almost entirely on plant material to identify wetlands. They have in their regulations that they use all 3 parameters, but their biologists are very strongly changed in field botany, and so they use the hydrophytic vegetation approach mostly. You go across the border of the state of Connecticut, okay, to determine where a wetland is, you must be a soil scientist over there because they look at soils to the exclusion almost totally of plant material. So it depends upon where you go. So DEC is going to be making some changes, and they're going to be happening January 1st of this coming year in 2025. That 12.4 acre size that they have jurisdiction over, that's going to be reduced down to approximately 7 acres. Okay, so they're going to have more regulation than less. They also are going to start to regulate vernal pools where they no longer did. So vernal pools can be as small as a third of this room, and potentially, but they may have a lot of important habitat for all sorts of threatened and endangered species. So if there's a vernal pool, and vernal pool is a special kind of wetland system. They're going to be regulating those as well. So that's going to be something the planning board is going to be dealing with, as well as the residents, because you're going to have more DEC involvement down the road rather than less. So DEC also does not classify streams and water bodies like lakes as wetlands unless they're a certain small size. They look at waters differently and have a separate code requirement for streams and water bodies. They rate them based upon classifications of AA through D. And AA is drinking water supply, and D is basically just recreational use more than anything else. It's the lowest classification. And DEC will ramp up their permitting requirements and regulations depending upon how high up you are in disturbing the streams or the water bodies. That type of permit that you have to get if you're within the stream bank or typically within the 50 feet or 100 feet of the bed and banks of the stream bank is called an Article 15 permit. So DEC, Article 24 permit, wetlands, DEC stream bank permits, Article 15 wetlands, okay? And this has to do with disturbance, right? So you're doing something close to the wetlands, whether you're digging up things or removing vegetation or grading or building a structure or putting a septic system. All those things will trigger the need for a permit and a review. So, as we indicated, because we're lucky enough to be in the DEP watershed, almost the entire town, DEP gets their hand in things as well. And they have folks who come out and they look at their jurisdictional elements as well. And what they deal with is dealing with septic systems and impervious surfaces within their particular watercourses. They are concerned about pollutant loading getting into their reservoir system, their drinking water supply. So they will have no septic systems are allowed in their watercourse and watershed jurisdictional areas, I should say. No impervious surfaces, asphalt paving, things like that. So a lot of times we've been dealing with roads that have been going over DEP watercourses, and you'll have to, within 75 feet of the center line of the stream, put pervious pavement in, porous pavement in to meet the DEP requirements. So they have their own set of rules and standards, septic systems, impervious surfaces, et cetera. And then we get to our town of Kent. Town of Kent is Chapter 39A, that's our freshwater wetlands law. And this is jurisdiction of the town of Kent. So remember DEC had 12.4 acres. Town of Kent regulates 40,000 square feet, roughly what we call an acre. Acre is actually 43,560 square feet, but typically 40,000 square feet is considered an acre in planning prospect. It's a little bit different, and this might be what John was getting to, because in the town of Kent, you need, it's called an and/or provision, meaning you need hydrology and/or hydrophytic vegetation and/or soils to demonstrate it's a wetland. That makes it much more possible to have a wetland because there might only be one parameter there and not three. So where would we see that? Well, somebody has a lawn surface and it's got grass growing on it, but it has had historical high water table and groundwater conditions to the extent where you do soil sampling, as I alluded to before, you would have hydric soils. That would not be typically a DEC wetland or a DEP wetland, or certainly an Army Corps, but it could be a town of Kent jurisdictional wetland. So that's why it's a very important distinction to make. Is that what you're going to? I figured. Okay. Town of Kent also regulates 100 feet away, 100-foot wetland buffer, okay? We also include in the town of Kent, as compared to DEC, water bodies and water courses are all lumped in as wetlands, okay? And this is any body of water which has 5,000 square feet of surface area over 9 months is a water body and jurisdictional, and any body of water that's flowing in an identifiable channel for 9 months is a water course, okay? So that little puddle after the rain, that's not going to make this, right? But this is what's the definition in the code. And the controlled area, again, for those is 100 feet. So this is what you need to get a wetland permit for in the town of Kent. This is right out of our code. So draining, dredging, excavation and removal of material, depositing any material, erecting any building or structure of any kind, any activity which might include a septic tank or any pollutant outfall into the system, any activity which impairs the several functions served by the wetlands. Remember, we talked about those functions at the very beginning. So if you have a wetland that's going to be impacted and flooding is going to occur because that wetland is impacted by the development, that's something that the planning board has to consider. And we're going to get to mitigation in just a second. Any clear cutting of live trees 5 feet above the ground within a quarter of an acre area, we see this an awful lot. People are not aware of that. So when it gets to the planning board, what are the planning board's considerations? What do they have to think about? And this is, again, out of the town code, okay? And I'm just going to let you read through these and have a look at these. But basically, these considerations are kind of like a balancing act, right? Are these particular impacts avoidable? Are they able to be mitigated? Are they acting to create a serious environmental issue post-construction? So all of these, as the planning board gets a wetland permit application, these are the thoughts that the planning board has to take a gander at in terms of how we're going to approve this. Is this going to be something that is going to be a benefit to the applicant, but also a benefit, or at least do no harm to the residents and the environment? When you make a determination for a wetland permit, the planning board basically goes through this process and how it's going to tick these particular thoughts off and determine as you go through, is this something that we feel is reasonable to issue a wetland permit for, okay? And this is, again, right out of the code. So there's direction, there's a cookbook in terms of we got an application before us. How do we handle that? How do we manage that? You know, what are the thought processes that we need to do to ensure that we are making everything considered? There are 3 basic parameters when you look at wetland projects and wetland considerations. The first is, and we talk to the planning board all the time about this, is that the first one is avoidance. The very best thing you can do is not mess with the wetlands at all. And if you can avoid the impact by modifying the plan, changing the size of the house, moving the driveway, not grading in that area, and you cannot impact the wetland, that is the first and most desirable way to deal with wetland issues. And the planning board does that all the time to their credit in terms of improving a project by reducing the impacts. The second step is that if you can't avoid the impacts, then you try to minimize it. So the roadway, the driveway is going to be 22 feet wide, but it's going to be partially in the wetlands. We're going to reduce the driveway width to 18 feet or 12 feet or whatever and reduce and minimize the impacts. We're going to move the septic system over here so the primary system is outside. We'll maybe have the expansion area in the buffer, but the primary won't be in the actual wetland buffer itself. So you're minimizing, you're changing the plan and minimizing it the best you can. The last step is to say, if I can't avoid the impacts and I've minimized them to the greatest extent I can, then you mitigate. So mitigation looks like this. If you have a wetland that's been impacted by a proposal, that wetlands function needs to be first determined, getting back to those functions we looked at. So maybe this wetland that is impacted was a really important wetland to attenuate flooding in the adjoining properties and in the neighborhood. When you go into that wetland and you're creating a permit because of an unavoidable impact, the mitigation that's designed must mimic the functional value that's lost. In other words, you cannot mitigate the loss of a floodplain wetland by creating a wetland that has a wonderful educational value. Okay? You can maybe add that as an adjunct, but you must consider the functional value of the wetland or buffer that's impacted to do the actual mitigation, the functional loss. So mitigation, what does that look like? Well, a lot of times we'll see plant material going into wetland buffers to create a greater density within the wetland buffer. Wetland buffers are important because they act as kind of a transition area between the developed area on the property and the actual wetlands itself. And they, as water flows through, surface water flows through on its way downhill to the wetlands, that existing preserved vegetation will filter out a lot of pollutants on its own before it gets to the wetlands. So buffers are very important, and that's why they're regulated. So maybe there'll be plantings done. Maybe there will be stormwater management that is considered by the planning board where there is presently no stormwater management. So you have a commercial property that was built in the 60s where they just paved it, put in a pipe, and shot it into the wetlands. Well, now you have an application before the board where you're looking at somebody wants to do something out there, and maybe there's an opportunity to say, all right, you're going to be in the wetland buffer with your project, but we're going to include in your proposal some stormwater management to reduce the pollutant loading from pre-construction levels during your project. And that can also be a form of mitigation. So there's a menu of different types of mitigation to consider, but again, the first step is to see if you can avoid the impacts altogether and minimize them as well. Okay, and then let's talk about, I just want to walk you through this mystifying process of what happens when somebody walks into town hall with a project. They want to do something. And this is what we try to do. And basically, this is the wetland process, but also can be applicable to the process in general. Usually the first time we hear about a project is from Vera in the planning department. And she'll email us and say, somebody's come in and wants to meet you, John and I, at the consultants meeting we have once a month in town hall, in or in Zoom. And they will come on and they will describe their project in an informal sense to us. We'll get a sense of what they'd like to do. We'll try to give them direction. And then at such time, they will submit an application, step 2, to the planning board. And if the application is found to be complete, they'll put on a planning board agenda in what's called above the line. Fondly, because that's something the planning board is going to have a presentation and discuss at their meeting, because we have something that's been submitted to us. At the same time, or roughly the same time, John and I will do a desk review. All this stuff we just talked about, DEC, environmental resource mappers, soil surveys, all of those things, we're going to be putting that together to try to get a composite of information together for the planning board so that we know what the impacts are as soon as possible and start to address them. John and I will then always go out and do a site inspection, because the only way to figure out where the wetlands are after you've looked at all this desk review stuff is you got to go out and look. It's not adequate to assume where wetlands are based upon just staying in your office and looking at maps. You have to go out and look at the site, and John and I do that. It also gives us a sense of the other elements of the project in terms of where the disturbance is, what the trees look like, and rock outcroppings and things like that. That time, we determine if a wetland permit is needed, if we haven't done so already.
Bruce, on that point, if it's a town... Oh, sorry.
There you go.
Sorry. If it's a town wetland regulation, the town can issue a wetland permit for it. But if it, for example, if a property is bouncing against a New York City DEP requirement, does DEP have wetland permits that they would issue in that case as opposed to a town permit?
Both.
So it is possible that you could bounce against state, city, and town wetland issues and require a permit from all three.
And that's absolutely right. And
Okay.
that's why we try to communicate as much as possible, because as I said at the very beginning, this is really confusing to a whole lot of folks, especially since all the layers of the regulation. And you can definitely get ping-ponged back and forth between all these regulatory agencies, thinking you're doing your best, and you are. But the fact is that, you know, we try to assist people and communicate so they know up front what's needed as much as we possibly can. And we work with their consultants as well that they've hired so that everybody's aware with that as well. And that's number 6, we write a review memo. And in those review memos, and at the workshop discussion, we usually try to go over all that stuff and indicate this is what we found, this is what's here, this is what we think might be missing, and try to get as complete an application as possible. The most complete applications are the ones that go through the most quickly and at the least amount of cost. At the planning board meeting, the planning board will comment on the plan, they will review our memos, they may suggest revisions to the plan in response to comments from the public, from the consultants, from the applicants, and then if the planning board is finally satisfied the application is complete, you will schedule a public hearing. It's required under our town code. At the public hearing, you would take public comment And oftentimes, that public comment will shape and change the actual application, the design of the application, and you will then hear the public comments, and at such time eventually close the comments in public hearing, and you may revise those plans in response to the comments. And then finally, a wetland permit is issued either one of three ways. Either you deny it and say that you've not provided adequate elements for, remember those considerations the board has to have in reviewing the permits that haven't met that criteria, or that you will approve it with certain conditions, like you got to do mitigation, or you've got to do an erosion control plan, which is the case with every single wetland permit, or you will just approve it outright. So there's approval, denial, and approval with conditions. And that's what we have for you today. So, any questions at all? A lot of stuff, pretty quickly. Jackie?
So when we look at New York State wetland regs, we look at New York City wetland regs in the town of Kent, it seems like the town of Kent's are the most stringent. Is that fair to say?
Right. In order to have their own regulations in New York State, municipalities have what's called a home rule law, which allows them to have their regulations as compared to state regulations. But the idea is that they have to be at or more stringent than the state regulations. So you're exactly right. So you can see DEC regulates 12.4 acres. Town of Kent regulates about an acre. So anything an acre or more is going to be regulated by Kent. So that gap between an acre and 12.4 acres is basically addressed by the town only. Once we get to 12.4 acres, then it's both a town and a DEC permit that's required as well.
Do you have a sense of when those when that part of the town code came from? Like, how long has that been in place?
Yeah, it gets revised periodically, but I think the original code was somewhere in the 1980s. Most of the towns were in the 1970s and 1980s in response to actually Earth Day and things going on at that particular time. So that's when most of the wetland codes were promulgated.
And how would we, if we were to benchmark that against, say, the 6 other towns in Putnam? I know I'm putting you on the spot, you may not know this, but how does the town of Kent's wetland town code compare to the other towns in Putnam?
So each town's different. Each town has their own regulatory thresholds. So if you go to different towns, you might find that the regulatory threshold is not 40,000 square feet, but is 1/4 acre, or it might be something like 5,000 square feet. Or there are certain towns that actually have no regulatory threshold size, and they basically go along with the 3 parameters. Each town is different in terms of how they regulate it, because remember, there's a science piece of this, right? That was, we discussed what constitutes an actual wetland, but then the regulatory piece is laws. Those laws are passed by the legislators in response to their constituents' recommendations and the needs for the community. Each community looks at these differently. Each community has a different threshold. Most communities, I think all communities in Putnam County and most in Dutchess County and certainly all in Westchester County have their own municipal wetland laws in addition to the state laws. As you filter up further into upstate New York, a lot of the municipalities do not have their own local town laws and rely strictly on DEC.
So just to follow on that, and then I'll stop.
Okay.
It sounds like the critical metric there is the size of the wetland from town to town, as opposed to whether they look at vegetation more, or whether they look at soils more, or is that fair to say from what you said?
I think that the metric piece of it has to do with the size of the wetland threshold, but also the methodology that they use, because again, some towns like Kent have an and/or provision, some towns do not. So I think, it's really, there's a lot of similarities, and virtually all towns reference the federal manual and what have you, but there are nuances and differences as you go from town to town.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Bruce, my understanding is that the United States Supreme Court recently narrowed the definition of wetlands for purposes of the Clean Water Act, which I guess means the Army Corps of Engineers has less to do than it did before. But as a result of that, is there any part of Kent that was previously regulated that is now not regulated? Or do the other regulatory agencies, namely DEC, DEP, and the town of Kent itself, sort of cover anything that would have been covered in a different way perhaps, but that's still covered by the other regulatory agencies?
Yeah. What Andy's saying is that recently the Supreme Court changed the regulatory thresholds and definitions of wetlands. There was a wetland definition a while back that was called Rapinoe decision, which basically included what's called significant nexus, wetlands that were tangential and near water bodies that were filtering, providing water, et cetera. And basically the change, Andy, was that they changed that aspect of it. And they are not as they're not regulating as much those areas. So to my knowledge, though, Andy, in terms of waters of the United States, we don't have a substantive change here in the town of Kent as you would compare to towns that have larger water courses and navigable waters and things of that nature. But that's not to say that if you're filling in a regulated wetland from DEC, you're going to be looking at an Army Corps of Engineer either jurisdictional determination, which basically you send in as a matter of course to the Army Corps just to make sure, because you just are never really positive. So you have what's called a JD or a jurisdictional determination. You send that form in, and then Army Corps of Engineer will either tell you that they're coming out to check, or you won't hear back from them within a 30-day or 45-day period, in which case they are not interested and you move along. So there's almost a case-by-case basis, but there's nothing that I've seen that's a really big red flag out of the Supreme Court for the town of Kent. What else? Okay, well, I want to thank you for all your attention. I know it's a lot. Wetlands are a lot of stuff, and of course, if you have any questions, please let me know. But thanks.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I get to follow Mr. Barber. I'm not as eloquent, nor am I as knowledgeable as him. But couple things to get business out of the way. For those of you that don't know me, my name is John Andrews. I serve as engineer to the planning board. I am a New York State licensed professional engineer. I'm a principal with the firm of Rohde, Soika, and Andrews, located in Poughkeepsie, New York. I have been in the practice of civil engineering, land use, and development for the better part of 40 years. And no, you can't know my age. I have served as the town engineer for several towns in Dutchess County. I currently serve for the town of Amenia. I handle stormwater reviews and comments for the town of LaGrange. And I, of course, work here in the town of Kent. Prior to that, for about 36 years, I was the duly named town engineer in the town of Fishkill. So a lot of the development that occurred in Fishkill occurred during my watch. So having established that, the first order of business, if you read Jackie's summary, this was supposed to be site planning, review of site plan requirements, erosion control applications, planning and local permitting. That's quite a mouthful. It's also a rather arduous task to group all those things together. So what I've kind of done is shorten this somewhat. And it's shortened down to site planning, site plan requirements, and the approval process. The reason I've kind of left out erosion control, more commonly known as the steep slope and erosion control permit, is because that almost deserves a course of its own. There's a lot more that goes on under that, and there's a lot of permutations. I follow Bruce. What he failed to tell you is, as part of the approval process, if you are getting a wetland permit in the town of Kent, you also need a steep slope and erosion control permit. So when you start to mix all this together and try to do it in less than an hour, I said, well, let's pare some things out and let's focus on a site plan. So my goal tonight is to try to give you some idea of what a site plan is, what its components are and the details. What are we supposed to be looking at and incorporating in that site plan? There are specific criteria. What is exactly the approval process? Who does what? What's the procedure? And then one of the things that has come very apparent, I think, to the planning board in the past year is what happens post-approval. There's a lot of things that have slipped through the cracks. And I think one of the things that will pay us to do is take some time and look at what happens post-approval. Again, I'm a little bit old school. So what I had done is I pulled together portions of site plans that you folks have looked at in the last year. I pulled site plans for Flintlock Storage and Kent Self-Storage too. And interestingly enough, they both have some of the issues that Bruce raised, particularly Flintlock. We had wetlands, we had a specific need for a soil determination, we had an overlap with DEC wetlands, we had all sorts of issues. So it's kind of somewhat fortuitous that we are looking at all these at the same time. So the basic question is, you've heard it, everybody says, well, you got to get site plan approval. Well, what's a site plan? Interestingly enough, your town code has a definition of site plan. And the definition of site plan is as follows: a rendering, drawing, or sketch prepared in accordance with the specifications of this chapter, in other words, your zoning code, and which shows the arrangement, layout, and design of the proposed use of a single parcel of land as shown on said plan. A site plan in its simplest form is a picture of what somebody wants to do. And it's a picture that's tailored to a specific piece of property. I've also prepared some handouts because it's easier for you folks to kind of follow along. And there's really no mystery here. Your town code has Chapter 77 zoning. You're all familiar with it. The members of the planning board are, the ZBA certainly is. And under Chapter 77, there is Article 17, which is special use and site plan requirements. The first section in there, 7759, deals with special use permits, or as alternately called, conditional use permits. I'm not going to spend much time on those, but the interesting thing is each application for a special permit must start with a site plan. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand out, I reprinted that code section for you all so you can follow along, because it really does provide an outline, and it kind of shows you the path that we must go on to review and approve a site plan. But we're going to skip the first section, 59, for special permits, because that's a different beast. And when we come back, I think one of the next sections deals with zoning, and at that time it's probably a little more pertinent to talk about it. So if you can kind of take one and pass it around, this is a reprint direct from your zoning code of the applicable code section. And I'll kind of wait till that gets handed out. Those are yours. Make notes. Use them as you see fit. You can take them and line your bird cage, as the old professors used to say. Hopefully it'll help you work your way through it. Okay, since everyone's got one, if you would kindly turn to 7760, approval of site plans. I am not going to read everything. That would be my downfall. But there are a couple key things that you need to understand. Purpose is pretty self-explanatory. You all know what we're doing and why we're doing it. Consistency requirement. You got to find and make sure. But the key there is the last sentence under that, which says the planning board shall determine whether the site use, site design, and architecture proposed by an applicant comply with the land use and environmental protection policies and objectives of the Town of Kent Master Plan. So you're taking a look at these things and making sure they meet the town standards. The next thing is, everybody says, well, we need a site plan. Well, what really do you need? What's the applicability? As you all know, in your zoning code, each of the districts has basically what they call a table which identifies the purpose and permitted use for each of the zoning codes. And there's an interesting asterisk under most of the codes, and I just picked one at random. It's the principal permitted uses, and then there's an asterisk, and it says, indicates use that is also subject to planning board site plan approval pursuant to this chapter. So in any case, any project basically that starts anew is going to, in most cases, if that asterisk is present, require a site plan. The next interesting one that gets a lot of people in trouble, and Bill will tell you this, is number 3 on the list, and it's any change in use from a conforming use to another conforming use. So how many times we have people come in and they want to change the, it was Joe's billiard parlor, now it wants to be Billy's car repair shop. Those are changes in uses. Both may be permitted, but they need an amended site plan. You all recall the most recent one we did for Tom. Used to be a bar, an old-fashioned gin mill. Somebody bought it, turned it into a martial arts studio. It's a change in use, both of which were permitted. It needed to go through the process. Non-conforming use, but for the most part, you're all pretty much familiar with these. I don't know if the zoning board has ever granted a use variance in this town. I don't think I've ever seen one.
No, I have not recent memory.
Yep. So that kind of doesn't fit, but usually new construction and so on and so forth. Now, interestingly enough, a couple years ago, we're trying to simplify the process. So at the recommendation from the planning board, the town board adopted a new section, exemptions and waivers for de minimis activities. It creates a scenario where there are 2 levels. There are certain projects that Mr. Walters, as the building inspector, can look at and waive the requirements. There are certain that are more detailed that the planning board can waive the requirements for. But the interesting thing here is if somebody wants to be considered under this de minimis provision, whether it's something for Bill or something the planning board, is there are specific requirements to get there. First is they have to complete a request. It's got to be in writing, guys. It's got to say, I would like to request the following. And then it has to have basically a recent as-built survey or site plan. One of the hang-ups that Mr. Walters has encountered is a lot of the uses here in town don't have a site plan. They don't even have a recent survey. So absent something like that, you can't waive it. You need to go through the process. If you got one and you mark it up in a red line and show what you want to do and it makes sense, it can be evaluated. And if it's determined to be de minimis, it doesn't have to go through the process. It should theoretically shorten the process. And there are certain requirements you would have to waive. There are certain exemptions. You can read them, but the key thing here is you need a good starting point. You need that initial request, you need a site plan, recent, and you need a markup that shows what you want to do. I think that the theme that you want to keep in mind here, everything is graphic. Everything here is you need a piece of paper and a plan that shows what you want to do. And the last one is, and this one kind of has come up in recent history, you had a couple sites where I think, Bill, they just did interior renovations. They weren't changing anything on the outside. They either restored a wall or took down a wall, whatever. That can be considered exempt and not necessary to go through the process if all they're doing is it's a permitted use. They're making some interior modifications, doesn't affect the interior, it's not a change in use, it can go on. And I think what ends up, the bottom line here is, and on the, what everyone needs to focus on is that no building permit or certificate of occupancy shall be issued until such plan has been approved by the planning board as provided, and no premises can be occupied or used until the requirements and any conditions of the planning board have been complied with. So theoretically, they can't start construction unless they get your approval. That's why Bill kicks a lot of people over to you. And they can't finish construction unless they've done everything you've asked. And we'll get to more later, but what you've asked, oftentimes we're now finding is not what they've done. And as a consequence, it creates another situation. So, what's a site plan supposed to contain? That's the $64,000 question. What's supposed to be there? Basically, in your own code, a site plan is supposed to start from an accurate boundary and topographic survey of the property. And that is to depict all the existing improvements, what exists out there, and what the grades are, which way the ground goes. The plan shall depict all proposed improvements, and it needs to be prepared by a New York State professional engineer, landscape architect, or architect. Now, there's a whole list, A through, I think it goes A through X, of what that plan is supposed to be required. But let's take a look at a couple plans. What I have, and before I do that, let me, so you can all follow along. I apologize for the scale, but what I did is I also reprinted the plans that I have up here at an 11 by 17 scale, so you can at least all have a copy of what we're looking at, and again, mark it up. So while that's being passed around, a lot of engineers do this differently. I have two site plans here. This is one that was done by Insight. It's for Flintlock. They have a plan, serves as the cover sheet, that they call existing conditions. And it's a pretty standard existing conditions sheet. It has the property boundary, it has topography, it, in this case, has both DEC and local wetlands. It shows their buffers. There was, if you all recall, there was a right-of-way. It shows the circumstances of the survey. When you're looking at these things, what you really need to understand is how the property fits together, what's around it, and there's a couple notes that you really need to key on, because it's important to understand what the origin of a base map is. So under the general notes, it tells you where this plan originated. And oftentimes you'll also find what they call the datum, the elevation criteria for what the topography is based on. In most cases, that's not significant, but if you also have an overlap with the floodplain, it becomes very significant, because the floodplain is based on a very specific datum, and unless they're the same datum, the information can become unreliable. But the idea under your plan is to have a fairly comprehensive existing conditions map. Now, Bruce, as Bruce said, most of these plans, when they appear to us, Bruce and I go out and take a look. Well, we usually take the existing conditions map, and we'll usually walk it and compare it and make sure that what exists in the field matches what's on the paper. You'd be surprised in how many times what's on the paper doesn't match what's in the field. But as required under your code, item number 1 becomes you need a good base map. All right. Get to my notes, pardon me. The next thing is you basically need a site plan. And in this case, the next sheet is the site plan that was paired for Kent Self-Storage 2. I took this one because it's actually a pretty good one, and it shows you the intent of what they want to do. It has the building, it has the utilities, it has the ingress and egress, it has parking, it has where the water tank is going, it has all the information. But there's also a couple things that you'll find are common to all site plans. The first one is, and you'll hear Bruce asks for it quite a bit, and it's a schedule of bulk regulations, or it's in this case, a zoning schedule. And what that is a chart that lays out the regulations, establishes the district, lays out the regulations for that district, and then how this complies or does not comply. In this case, the engineer did a pretty good job. He has a column that you don't often see, but is important, is a variance required. And in this case, no variances were necessary. This goes a little farther. It basically identifies some of the information. It does impervious areas of disturbance, impervious cover types, gives you a parking schedule. It gives you all the details. It establishes the basis of their request, and it ties it into the requirements of your code. And again, what you'll find is there's a layout plan. Typically, you look at this layout plan to have dimensions. The key dimensions are, where is the building with respect to the property lines? How does it line up? Does it fall within the yards? Are the yards shown? All that information is on here. Where access is derived, driveway. But I stress to everybody, and Bruce is probably, I think, the same as myself in this regard, we spend a lot of time reading the notes and reading the fine print, if you will. Because in essence, the picture is great. Picture's easy to see, but you got to make sure that the picture, the notes, and our code all say the same thing. And I can't tell you how many times people will copy something out of the code and there'll be a typo. And it's not what it's supposed to be. So, you know, we spend a lot of time looking at those. There's other information on this one. There's some basics of the owner, the developer. It gives you all the specifics of what's the tax map, what districts it's located in. It gives you a whole bunch of information. But I would stress upon you, when you're looking at a site plan, what you'll find in probably 95% of the cases, they all have the same basic information. It might not be on a sheet that says site plan, it might be on another sheet, but ultimately this all needs to be there. And that's why you'll find a lot of our comments on our initial submittal deal with, hey, you need a bulk regulations table. Hey, you need to identify where the survey came from. You need to tell us where the topo came from. You need that basic information. The next, there's a couple things in your code that people miss that probably need to be covered. One is item H, the location of access roads and fire protection features. One of the things that you have to take into account, and that's why, again, Bruce and I oftentimes recommend that you refer everything to the fire district. Ultimately, they need to use this site. They need to be able to access the site. They need to be able to respond to an emergency, whether it's an ambulance, whether it's a fire, whatever it may be, and they need to be comfortable that when they hit this site, they can get where they need to get and do what they need to do. And I think that's important. The other thing here that it is vitally important on a lot of these sites, is it going to be phased? Are we going to do it all at once? Are we going to just build this portion and then come back in a later date and do something else if it works? But the site plan is where you establish what those phases need to be. And it's not what you folks want, it's the developer, the proposer needs to tell you what it's going to be. The next big thing, and it kind of goes together, is in any good site plan, this is just another sample of a site plan. This is Insight site plan for Flintlock. They do not call it a site plan. They call it a layout and landscaping plan. A lot of engineers do double duty because as long as the information is legible, you can put as much as you want on the sheet. But this one is a pretty good representation. But the key thing, and again, it's one that Bruce and I spend a lot of time on because there's a lot that evolves from it. And that's called the grading and utility plan. The grading is exactly what it suggests. How are they going to shape this piece of property to accomplish what they want? How's the building going to fit on the site? Is it going to be tucked into a hill? What's the driveway going to be? Is it going to meet driveway standards? Where are the utilities laying out? Where's the stormwater going? Where's it connected to? Oftentimes, that's probably the second sheet that Bruce and I spend most of our time on because it kind of fleshes out all the details. And if there's going to be a blemish, usually you'll find the blemish in either the grading or the utilities. Something doesn't make sense. Remember, sewage flows downhill unless you pump it, and if they got it going the wrong direction, you gotta fix it. So it's a very key drawing, and what you will often find is some engineers will do just a grading plan and just put the drainage basins on it. Others will do a grading and utility plan. Some will just do a utility plan. And what you find down here in Kent, and it was under Kent Self-Storage, they also, some engineers will just provide a septic, a health department plan. Because Putnam County sometimes requires so much information that if you put that all on one sheet, you can't read anything. So they prepare a separate septic sheet. So a lot of times you'll find kind of sheets that have the same information twice, but one's identified as health department, one's identified as grading and utility. The last big thing here under that is stormwater management. And stormwater management is related, as I started saying beginning, to the erosion and sediment control plan. It's related to the stormwater pollution prevention plan. It's related to a lot of things, but it's a key factor of any site plan. And there are other elements here. There's a lighting plan with this particular one. And again, most lighting plans are fairly similar. They basically start from the site plan. They place the lights on the site plan, and then they give you a printout of foot candles. And there's key things you got to look at. What is the mounting height of the lights, and what the foot candle printout says. Now, most foot candle printouts, as this one is, they're unadjusted for elevation, they're unadjusted for other things. They're just a flat printout. And depending upon how the site goes, it may vary, but it gives you a pretty good idea of what the light levels are. I know they're rather difficult to read. It looks like a little bunch of little numbers in the middle of nowhere, but each one of those is a light level. Each one of those gives you an idea of how bright the site is. And it's a key thing. That's kind of the basics of each plan. You can look through them at your leisure. I know you folks have seen them all. I know you folks have read Bruce's memo and my memo, but the first thing we do is look at compliance with these basics. The next thing is, and it's required by your code, and it's called Site Plan Design Criteria. And they have a series of elements, basically I through T. And those elements are what goes into putting a site plan together. I is the relationship of the structures of buildings to the site. J is the relationship of non-residential uses to residential uses. K is landscape buffering and site treatment. M is building design. N is parking and loading. O is materials and equipment storage and waste containers. P is ecological considerations. That's wetlands, water courses, other ecological environmental concerns. Q is drainage. R is traffic. S is pedestrian circulation. And believe it or not, and I never really focused on this, you do actually have an architectural review provision. You can actually review what the building looks like and comment on it in terms of design, function, how it's laid out, how it would appear. So, and the thing that I kind of noticed in going through and preparing for this is you folks most often do all this stuff without realizing you're doing it. You know, the questions you ask. How's a fire truck going to get in there? Where's your refuse going to go? If I'm going to use the nail salon, where do I park? You know, all those things you kind of do. Can self-storage, one of the big issues, and I think Simon caught it, and then it became even more pertinent during the public hearing process, was the relationship of this non-residential use to residential uses that were up on the hill looking down on it. By the time they cut the trees and what are the people up the hill who've been looking at a hill going to see once there's a building plunked on there? So that led to a rather vivid and detailed landscaping plan and landscaping discussion. So again, like I said, most of this stuff you already do, but it would pay you to kind of read some of these because, you know, they're things that you kind of do, but sometimes you really specifically need to do. Let's take that piece of property. Remember, we're going to put the driving school, and then Finney was going to put his building there. One of the things that jumped out at me is one of the things that you're supposed to look at is the transition between the street and into the site. And if you remember, the Finney proposal had that apartment building kind of tucked in the back to try to kind of isolate it from the residential neighborhood in the back, but in the front, he had all the parking, and it was like right up against 52, and it was like, oh, wait a minute, we're not sure that. So, you know, those are the things that you have to look at and revisit. And my suggestion to you is they probably need to be revisited on a fairly regular basis. If we're going to do our job, it's probably a question you should be asking Bruce or myself, or you should even be asking yourself is, you know, do I want this in my town? That's essentially what you, and if I can make it better, can we do this? Can we do that? So I think the one thing that jumped out at me is, like I said, the planning board generally does this on a fairly regular basis, but sometimes we all collectively might want to revisit it. The other interesting thing I found is that everyone seems to think that if you look at the site plan section, you got all the answers. Well, you actually don't. Because if you go a little farther, what you will find is there are design standards that you have to employ that are located throughout your code. For instance, if you go to some of the zoning provisions, and again, we'll cover that, but each of the zoning districts has their own design standards. So in addition to some of the stuff, there are design standards that you have to take into account. So there again, that's why when you get a memo from Bruce and I and something's in the IOC zone, we'll jump back and say, hey, IOC zone says you got to have this. Well, it's not in this chart under site plan, but it is in the IOC zone. So there's a lot of jumping back and forth. And there's a lot of places that you wouldn't think to look. Bruce and I do that on a regular basis, but and again, it's something oftentimes a member of the planning board will ask, you know, why are you putting the refuse enclosure there? Anybody driving into the site is going to see the garbage the first thing. Can't you find a better location? That's a requirement. So, and so I think hopefully I've answered some of your questions on what it takes to put together a site plan and what we should be looking at. Before I move on to the next part, which is kind of like the approval process, has anybody got any questions? Is it making sense? So, okay, you got an application, you got what constitutes a complete application, if I may. You've got all the information in front of you. It graphically makes sense. You got your questions basically answered. So the way your code is written, it kind of goes through a simplified process. There's a couple things that are not clearly spelled out, how it dovetails with the seeker process, the state environmental quality review process. That's not in there, but that's a necessary element. But the way your code is laid out, there's a couple things that kind of get lost. Your code actually has the provisions for a preliminary site plan approval to be followed by a final site plan approval. So I don't know if Putnam County does it, but in Dutchess County, you can't go to the health department for any type of health department review or approval until you have a preliminary site plan approval. So some projects will, particularly bigger projects, will get that approval in 2 bites. They'll come in for a preliminary approval, you'll hold a public hearing at preliminary, and then you'll give them, when you give them a preliminary approval, you can condition it. Don't come back to us until you got health department. Don't come back to us until DOT has advanced their review of this project. Don't come back to us for these matters. And then they come back for a final site plan approval. And again, you can hold a public hearing or you can waive a public hearing. But on some of the projects, it gives the developer a chance to get a concept plan that everybody's comfortable with. Say, yeah, if you do this plus X, Y, and Z, we'll consider it for final. Gives you a second bite and a second chance for the public to review it. We don't often utilize that because my experience with the board is you folks usually kind of push them to the point that, except for maybe health department approval, you've got essentially the plan you want. So what you typically have done in these two, you did preliminary and final in the same approval. And all they had to do was get the outer agency approvals. But in some of the other ones, I think if I reviewed the record correctly, Patterson Crossing was a 2-bite approval. They got preliminary approval, and then they came back once they got some of the other issues involved because there was other communities, there was other things, then they came back for a final. So you have that in your arsenal of how to review these things. You can do that. And then, much like the wetlands, you have the ability to approve, you have the ability to approve with modification, and you have the ability to deny. And when it comes to approval or approval with modification, you can also attach such conditions or safeguards as you in your discretion, deem necessary to ensure compliance with what goes on. So you can establish whatever conditions you need. You're usually pretty good about that. And one of the things that I think is key that gets lost around here, notable point recently was Winkler, no site preparation of any type can take place until the final site plan is signed. And what we're finding is people are not reading those last 3 conditions in the resolution, which says you got to get all this stuff done, and when you think you got it done, you got to make a full and complete submittal to the planning board to be reviewed, either Bruce or myself, to ensure that all the conditions have been necessarily satisfied, and only then can the chairman sign the plans. People are not reading and not following that. Brings me to the last section, and I'm not going to belabor this point because it puts a lot of pressure on the gentleman known as the building inspector. And you'll read the section. It's kind of interesting because basically, once they get signed plans, they're going to build what's on the plans. That's what they said they wanted. That's what they got. They accepted the conditions. That's what they're supposed to build. So they should go out and build it. If they can't build it, there are a number of things that they can do. If it's a major issue, they've got to come back for a site plan amendment. And they've got to come back for the amendment before they actually do the work. Okay? It's not, oh, we decided to lop off the west wing and put a parking spot there. No, you got to get approval before you do that. There's an inspection process that Mr. Walters goes through. If he catches something, he has the ability to enforce the site plan. And it's fairly specific. He can issue a stop work order. If they're not building according to plan, he can stop them. And he's done that. You know that. But the other thing, too, is, and a couple people have availed themselves of it, they can get a field change amendment. They go out there and they say, okay, we were going to blast out this rock knob. Well, we decided we're not going to blast out the rock knob, we're going to leave it. So we want to amend the way the parking goes. Okay, can they do that? They can. Do they need to file a letter and make an informal request and appear in front of the planning board? Yeah. Vidiello did it. They made some minor changes, and you said, hey, tell us what quantity of rock you're going to remove. Well, we're not removing any. Okay, you got your approval. But the key thing here is that people have to come back. And it's not made that onerous. It's actually made quite easy because you just got to do it. And they can go through the field change process. Bill has the ability to make minor changes. Bruce and myself, according to your code, actually have the ability to make minor changes. If we go out there and somebody says, hey, I don't want to do this with a driveway, I want to do that. If it's minor, we can do that. And if none of us, 3, feels comfortable, we're comfortable recommending it to the planning board, but it needs to go to the planning board to make sure that they got no issues. So it's an easy process. But I think we have to stress upon people that they need to avail themselves of that process. And then the last one is, you can actually prosecute these. And Bill has done that too. He can issue stop work orders, he can take them to court, he can do all sorts of things. But again, it's an easy process if people would just pay attention. And I think that's what we've got to kind of do going forward. The last couple things that kind of get lost is there is a requirement in your code, and I think the next site plan we go through, we've done it in other places, is there's an as-built plan requirement. Before they get their final CO, we need to have an as-built plan that shows what was built, and it needs to be certified by somebody that's in substantial compliance with the approval. In most cases, we don't get that, do we, Bill?
No.
No. So we need to get that. And then the last one is, again, it's in your code. They need to maintain the site. They need to keep the site up in conformance with your approved plan. That means if the trees die, they got to replant them. They got to restore them. If they can't do with what's there, they can get a field change, or they can come back for a site plan amendment to change the landscaping. But they're required to keep it up. They can't let litter and trash. They can't let things overgrow. They can't store cars in the front yard where no cars for storage in the front yard were approved. So I was really surprised in reading the code, the latitude that you do have in terms of enforcement. We've kind of been, how shall I say it, Bruce and Bill, a little easy on most of the people.
Yeah.
But I think if experience in the last year has shown us anything, we need to get a little harder on some of these people. And, they need to do a better. The interesting thing here is the onus is on the applicant and/or the project sponsor to give you the information you need. It's not up to you folks to generate it. It's up to you folks to comment on it. But in order to comment on it, you got to get it from them. And, I think it would pay to kind of keep for a short period of time this kind of listing, this code section in front of you, because I often find, and I'm sure Bruce does the same thing, I get some of these site plans and I go right back to the code and I go through and I actually have a checklist in my file that says, okay, did they give me this? Yeah. Did they not give me this? And oftentimes, that's where a lot of our comments originate. And and usually if you get what you're looking for, good case in point is Flintlock. Bruce was adamant about certain things. I think we ended up with an enhanced wetland. We ended up with an opportunity to improve previously not the best situation. We cured an evil for DOT. There was a pipe there that nobody knew about. But it was all a function of doing our homework and holding them to the requirements of the site plan. And that's all I have to say. And I hope it was helpful. I know it wasn't as eloquent as Bill or Bruce, but.
I have a question. My mouth is big enough, I don't need the mic.
I used to say that, but Paul tells me even mine is not big.
It appears that the zoning board, at least, are seeing a lot more of 239M referrals coming through. And relative to that, I'm looking at the page 2 of section 7761, which details what falls under the parameters of the 239M. Under B, it says the boundary of any existing or proposed county or state or other recreation area. Now, my question is, if the land is owned by the city of New York, and residents can enjoy it by use of special permit, does that fall under the 239M?
Yeah, a lot of times Bruce and I will err on the side of caution and belt and suspenders. We'll send it to DEP whether it's clear or not, but usually what we find, if it borders or is in close proximity to DEP property, they all of a sudden take an interest in it. So, but technically, yes, you should. And I work with a series of attorneys, and what they would suggest is, if there's any doubt or it's unclear, make the circulation. Then you've at least done your homework. And so, matter of fact, we have one now, Morrow Equipment, as you,
Yeah.
okay? It's adjacent to I-84. I-84 is a federal highway. People balked, but we referred it to the Federal Highway Administration. Why? The potential is you might see it from there and they might have some visual concerns. So the thought process, again, is it may not be a direct line. In other words, we can't snap that clear, direct line, but there's enough of a potential connection that I'd rather be cautious and conservative and let them tell me they're not interested or not respond.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So John, in a perfect world, after we approve a site plan, right, permits are issued, construction starts within a year, completion within 2 years, that's a perfect world. Any changes made during that process, they talk with Bill, they talk with you all, let's assume they're minor, you approve them, those get put into the as-built, and it comes back to the planning board prior to getting a COO. Is that?
They don't, the as-built does not come back to the planning board. The as-built goes to the building inspector, and in most cases, I know in other towns, if the building inspector gets an as-built, he typically refers it out to the engineer and/or the planner to make sure, but
That was exactly my question. We don't see
No.
as-built, you all see as-built.
Yeah.
Got it.
Most of the as-bills that I see are as-built for the construction of the house, not the property itself.
Oh, okay.
And if you're familiar, and again, it kind of jumps the shark a little bit. Under the steep slope and erosion control permit, there's typically a requirement for an as-built, particularly if they have stormwater management features or there are wetlands involved, to make sure they didn't trespass or get too close to the wetlands. And in some cases, we've actually brought them back to you. It hasn't been in recent times, but back a couple years ago when I first started, we brought a couple back because they didn't do what they were supposed to do.
So the permits have a closeout process as well as all when you get your COO, you've closed out the permits, you've closed out the as-built. No.
When I issue a CO for the house, because I know the planning board has up to 2 years for the erosion control plans to be signed off and inspected and closed out that way.
On a site plan, what typically happens, in the last year, which was the one, 2 years ago, it was the Presbyterian Center up on the other side of town. They did that, a big addition. So what happens is they got TCOs from Bill. They got temporary certificates of occupancy. Bill made a call to Bruce and I and said, hey, I'm expecting to issue a final CO. Can you guys go out and take a look? We had an as-built in hand. They did do an as-built. We went out and took a look. We made our recommendation to him. Usually it's a coordination effort. But as Bill says, some of the final permits, you're required to, some of the final bonds have a 2-year holding period. So they might get, but that 2-year holding period stops when we issue a notice of termination. In other words, everything's restored. So that starts then. So they may have a CO, they may have submitted the as-built. It's just a waiting period, and we go back at the end of 2 years to make sure everything is still the way it's supposed to be.
And at that point, then, that's when the bonds are returned.
That's when the bonds are returned. That is correct.
Because I've been issuing a lot more TCOs than what I'm really comfortable doing. I got much more that we will be issuing shortly for some large projects that you guys have approved already. You're ready to occupy the building. But the properties aren't doing that.
Okay. And that's often the case. And every town has it differently. For instance, I do a lot of work in the town of Poughkeepsie. In order to get a TCO, you have to have a preliminary as-built, and you have to walk through the inspection with the engineer. He'll say, okay, you want a TCO, X, Y, and Z has to be done. You get a TCO. You want your final CO, I want A, B, and C done. And that's the way it goes. And the building department is pretty strict on that. You can't kick people out of a building, but a lot of financing, final mortgages, other things don't convert until they have a full certificate of occupancy, unconditioned. So that's the incentive for most, that's why most homeowners really push, because they want that final CO so they can get their, if they're built under a construction permit, they can't convert that to a final mortgage until they have the final CO. So there's a lot of overlapping issues.
I just want to say thank you for everybody coming first. And also, John and Bruce, thank you very much for putting the presentations together. They were excellent. And the brain behind this was actually Jackie and Vera. They both helped a lot to make this all come through. And it's much better to come here to our town and to go through stuff that's actually more applicable to us than to venture down to Westchester to do our classes down there. So I want to say thank you very much for everything.
Thank you.
Next class is